And yeah, don't. And by the way, this is probably about the worst that you'll read for confusion. This is probably the hardest text that you'll read in here. So you can breathe a sigh of relief after this. The text for next week is certainly a lot easier in that way, and I think really pretty much everything else is. Okay, so you like her interpretation of the architecture. I do too. Wicker and right, we've all noticed the wicker. That's very conspicuous. Clearly, there's something hinky going on there. And Susanna again shouting out with the disorientation. Um, Jabberwocky, yeah, as a misuse. Yeah, and I'll get to Susanna's comment about the misuse of myths or the misquoting of myths, I guess, because that both is and is not true. What you pointed out, but yeah, this is a little bit like Jabberwocky, except I guess most of the words are actual words, but the nonsense is there. Um, Number three, I wonder if learning something in a way you don't expect goes along with the dream state. It's your mind revisiting all the issues of the day and trying to resolve them. Um, is this Chaucer's brain thinking outside of the box? Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point because when our dreams are, when our brain is using our dreams to resolve things, it doesn't go about it in a straightforward way. If your problem is, I can't decide whether to take that job, your dream is not going to be you taking the job and finding out how it works out. Your dream is going to be about you in your first grade classroom having a fist fight with Jerry Seinfeld and eating biscuits or something. Nevertheless, somehow all of those elements are relevant to you and they influence your thinking. So, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you want to say, gosh, people in the Middle Ages didn't understand that much about dreams, did they? But I mean, Chaucer talks and thinks about them all the time, and he's got all these authorities on dreams that he cites, Macrobius, notably. He's got biblical dream theory with Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, and he certainly has thought about dreams as much as anybody that I can think of. So you may be right about that. Um, yeah, no, so this is interesting. I want to look at this for a little bit. The idea of a distant versus a present judge, um, and you reference Psalms with that. The idea of the Judeo-Christian God that can be called on, come to us, come and judge us. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think this is a different kind of judging. I mean, I think the judgment of fame is different than a legal judgment, and it's different from a theistic judgment, even though these are gods and goddesses. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I've got a good parallel statement for this comment. I think you may well be right. I can't get myself to ring any bells with it. But I'll think about that. I think that's interesting. Moving on now to, I believe, Susanna and her response. Okay, good responses. A lot of bulk here and a lot to talk about, and so I appreciate those. Number one, the poem seems to be saying literature can be quite confusing for the reader. It is also demonstrating that literature can be quite confusing. Um, yeah, so here, this is where you talk about the Aeneid, and you talk about the Dido story, and I'm trying to remember exactly what sort of version or redaction of the Aeneid story that Chaucer would be working with that he would know, and it's not going to be straight from Virgil, but it might not be too bad of a redaction of Virgil. But anyway, what I wanted to say about this, I mean, I think you're certainly right, taking right from Virgil all the things that you're saying about Dido and Anna and the way the goddesses intervene. Um, I guess what I want to say is that there's certainly different versions of that myth around. It's referenced all over the place. It's referenced in Ovid. It's referenced in some of the historians. And I guess it would depend on what Chaucer has got to hand as to whether or not we want to consider that he is ignoring this element. But anyway, the element you're talking about is the fact that Dido doesn't just fall in love without help. That Juno and Venus also work to make her fall in love with Aeneas. And it's funny because Juno and Venus are working at opposite purposes, but they both see that they can each accomplish their purpose by having Dido and Aeneas fall in love, and so they work together to make it happen. I think too, especially with it's true of the Troy story, but it's also true here of the Aeneid, that there are versions of the story that really highly emphasize the intervention of the goddesses, and then there are versions which rely a lot more heavily on human agency. The idea that Dido and Aeneas just sort of fell in love in the way that normal people fell in love, and if the goddesses helped, it wasn't a deal maker or deal breaker. So anyway, I don't know. I think, towards the end of this, you write, the Eagle points out the narrator sits down to read books and becomes very confused, and then reads more, and he's making a mess of things. And I think you're right about that. I do think that the Eagle is making fun of Chaucer's abilities as a reader. For sure. And I mean, and that's one of the comedy things that he does is talks about what a dopey guy Chaucer is. And of course, Chaucer, this is interesting, Chaucer operating as a character, as the narrator, but then Chaucer, the author, we know that he's not dumb. We know that he knows his source material. We know that he is astute. So it takes on a particularly kind of pointed and funny little bit of satire when he makes fun of himself for being this dopey little scribbler who thinks he knows a lot about books, but doesn't really. And I kind of think that's what's going on here. Number two, the eagle making fun of the narrator is the funny thing about it. It really is, I think. And let's see. Oh, right. Well, yeah. Once again with the Aeneas story. And there, yeah, you're right. I mean, he's definitely taken liberties with the story to make the point that he wants to make. Number three is this a work of science fiction, and you write about the talk of physics and sound and stars, and right, that's where the science is coming in those three places in terms of acoustics and in terms of astronomy. And by the way, Chaucer's astronomy and astrology are pretty much going to be the same thing, which is, to us seems kind of silly, but to them they were a single science, astronomy and astrology, and the degree to which they thought that the planets and stars influenced you varied, because of course then they also had to reconcile that with Christianity. So in general, though, there was a thought that your star sign or whatever could predispose you a certain way, but that you still were possessed of free will and could, work for it or against it, depending on how you wanted to proceed. Number four, this is really good. The three houses seem to be indicating different ways to learn. The first is a temple that offers records of past literature, but leaves the interpretation up to the seeker of truth. Right, it's almost a passive experience. Here is the story, and you look at it and you interpret it, and things like that. The House of Fame, on the other hand, is you kind of have a choice. You can walk in and mingle, but it doesn't seem to deliver, as you write, one message about the truth of love at all. It looks like love is chaos, and you can learn by watching other people around you in life, but it won't help. You can, again, as you say, you can make of it what you will. The third building is supposed to be the place where he really is going to learn something, but as you say, it really seems to be the place where he's the least likely to learn anything. Everything's spinning around, and it's crazy, and it's chaotic, and the final moment when we kind of have the promise of learning something, we even have that taken away. So I like that idea that each structure represents a slightly different or well, in the third case, a very different, but different ways of learning and finding out about things. Um, all of which, at least to the author, prove kind of futile. I mean, he doesn't. I don't know what he learns, but it's not much. Callie thinks that Susanna is smart and writes good responses, and I think she's right. Um, yeah, and again, this idea of this is such an elusive poem that you really have got to sort of go back and look at things. And again, in the same way that I think this is the most confusing poem, it probably is the most um, heavily elusive poem. This is probably the one where you would have the most cause to Google. But I think that I think you'll find it kind of lightens up after this a little bit. Sarah writes, Susanna, I had the same idea. History is perceived to be more authoritative, but didn't have such a sound argument. The Eagles' interaction with the narrator is funny to me at times, but I fear much of the humor was wasted. My inability to comprehend what I was reading. Yeah, it's this, it's kind of the same thing with Shakespeare jokes. For every 10 that he's got, you're probably getting 7 of them, but there are a few that are you're just gonna miss, and that's just the way it is. But I think when you kind of catch his personality, you'll get more, and you will find a lot of the Canterbury Tales funny. I mean, um, there's no subtlety needed, nothing, no sophistication involved in some cases there. So I hope that you'll find it, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. Finally, I too felt the narrator's journey became more chaotic and frustrating throughout the poem. Um, you actually cringed when you read about the Wicker House. But yeah, I think so. I mean, it's claustrophobic, it's chaotic, it's you feel like it's going to fall apart at any time. He does a really great job of kind of keeping you off balance in that way, and replicating what the narrator is feeling, which I think is a sign of his skill. Okay, and finally, let's see. Julie has got her response. Number one, Listry, Listry and literature, history and literature. Um, right, it is, and I like to hear you said someone who's not so well versed might become confused and wonder what is history and what is literature. But I think that there is a confusion, and as I say, in Chaucer's world, there's very much a confusion. I don't think it's necessarily clear at all. I mean, if the only difference is literature rhymes and history doesn't, then it's not as substantial as the difference that we have now. You right, most will equate this question with what is the truth and what is fictional or a lie. Um, Literature generally comes from the imagination of those who write it, but does that mean a little truth cannot be included? Right. No, I mean, I think that this is what I was saying before. You're absolutely right that um, a work of fiction may have no facts, but a bunch of truth in it. And in fact, if it's any good, it does have truths in it, which, this is why we study literature, is we think that this is one way of getting at capital T truth, which is additional to history and science and things like that. As for history, who writes history? Man, and by that I mean capital M to represent the human race. Although we could also argue that for the most part, until pretty recently, also man as in the gender. That men write the history, and particularly men who are quote the victors, the ones who are left standing to write the books, and the ones that they've defeated aren't writing anything. Historically, history has been viewed as more authoritative because it's to be recorded objectively. But again, the idea being ideally history is objective, but we know that it's not. And two, you can have a work of history that is slavishly correct to every last fact, but doesn't reveal any great truth. I mean, if history is simply a recording of things that happened without an interpretation, I'm not sure what truth that it leads us to either. But that's not very good history. If there's not interpretation, then it's just sort of a chronicle. Number two, yes, Chaucer has put himself in the line of the great authors, and this is kind of in the vein of Dante and Dante's Inferno when he goes down to the first circle, and the great poets of antiquity are there, Virgil and Homer and folks like that. They tell him, yes, you are one of our number. You're part of the club. So I don't know, and I don't